The Scarlet Thread, the key, was still warm from his hand when Anna heard the train whistle scream its final warning. She stood paralyzed in Major Klaus Richter's apartment, the stolen documents spread across his desk like accusatory fingers, names, addresses, execution orders for 300 Polish resistance fighters, her people, her blood. Bzzz. In 30 seconds, the train would pull away from Warsaw Hauptbahnhof, carrying the only man she had ever loved straight into the maw of the Eastern Front, where the Reich sent its officers to die. The key in her palm, the documents at her fingertips, the whistle fading. Anna Kaminska had exactly one choice left: save her country or save her soul. But to understand how a Polish Catholic doctor's daughter came to stand in a Nazi officer's bedroom, holding the power to murder or redeem, clutching the key he'd pressed into her hand like a wedding ring, to understand that you must go back to the beginning. Back to the moment she first saw his glacial blue eyes across an operating table slick with a dying man's blood. Back to the day she learned that in war, the enemy doesn't always wear a uniform you can hate. The Anatomy of Respect first incision, October 1942, Warsaw General Hospital, occupied Poland. The constant, low hum of the ceiling lamp in Operating Theater 3 was the monotonous pulse of the occupation itself, a mechanical drone that made Anna Kaminska want to scream just to hear something human. But she didn't scream. She couldn't. Screaming was a luxury reserved for people who still had the privilege of being heard. Anna stood on the wrong side of the operating table, scrubbed bare of her identity, and clad in the thin, humiliating cloth of a hospital assistant's uniform. The fabric was coarse, deliberately uncomfortable, a constant reminder pressed against her skin. You are nothing now. You are less than nothing. 6 months ago, she had been Dr. Anna Kaminska, youngest surgical resident at Warsaw Medical College, her father's pride, her mother's hope. She had worn the white coat with the university crest. She had made rounds with Professor Wojcik, discussing differential diagnoses in rapid Polish, her hands confident, her future certain. Then the Wehrmacht had consolidated their grip. New regulations. The medical college was restructured. Polish doctors were systematically dismissed, their licenses revoked, their positions filled by German physicians. The occupation needed the infrastructure, the hospitals, the equipment, the buildings, but not the Polish expertise that came with it. Those who protested disappeared into Pawiak prison. Those who accepted demotion survived. Anna had chosen survival. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she could still help people, even from the shadows. She told herself these lies every morning when she pulled on the assistant's uniform and swallowed the bitter pill of her reduced existence. Now she stood opposite the man who embodied everything she had lost. Major Klaus Richter, Wehrmacht Medical Corps, worked with the lethal efficiency of a master craftsman. His hands moved with balletic precision, clamp, suture, cut, each motion economical, purposeful, utterly confident. He was tall, perhaps 35, with the sharp aristocratic features of old Prussian lineage, high cheekbones, a narrow nose, a jaw that could have been carved from marble. His eyes were the pale, penetrating blue of winter ice. Anna hated his flawless technique. Each perfect suture was a reminder of her own diminishment. Each command delivered in clipped, technical German was another small death of her former self. "Tapfer," Richter said, his voice barely above a murmur. "Swab." Anna's hand moved automatically, placing the gauze into his palm with the forced precision that survival demanded. She'd been compelled to learn medical German in 3 brutal weeks. Learn or be dismissed to the factories, where Polish women's bodies were consumed by the machinery of the Reich's war production. Clamp. Her fingers closed around the instrument, passed it over. Brilliant. The patient on the table, a young Wehrmacht private with a shrapnel wound in his abdomen, groaned through his ether haze. Anna felt nothing. She had learned to cauterize her empathy. It was the only way to function. The surgery was routine, a removal of metal fragments from the peritoneal cavity. Richter's hands never hesitated. He worked like a man solving a familiar mathematical equation, each step following logically from the last. The German surgical team around them operated with the same mechanical harmony, the anesthesiologist monitoring vitals, the scrub nurse anticipating needs, everyone moving in their prescribed role. Anna was the only Pole in the room, the only conquered person permitted to witness the conqueror's vulnerability. Shear, scissors. She handed them over. and their fingers touched for a fraction of a second. His gloved, hers gloved, the contact utterly impersonal and yet somehow significant. Richter's eyes flicked to hers, just for an instant, and she saw something unexpected in that glacial blue. Assessment. He was measuring her competence. The recognition made her furious. She didn't want his assessment. She didn't want to be seen by him, not as a person, not as a professional. Not as a professional. She wanted to be invisible, to do her work and slip away into the gray anonymity of survival. But Richter kept watching her, even as his hands continued their work. "The fragment is against the mesenteric artery," he said suddenly, speaking directly to her in German. Sure, not a command this time, an observation. If I pull incorrectly, he bleeds out in 90 seconds. What is the approach? The question landed like a slap. The other Germans in the room went still. This wasn't protocol. Assistants weren't asked for clinical opinions, especially not Polish assistants. Anna's throat went dry. This was a test, and she didn't know what failure looked like. Silence or the wrong answer? Proximal control first, she heard herself say in careful German. Clamp the superior mesenteric before extraction. Then remove the fragment along its entry trajectory to minimize vascular tear. Richter's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Correct, he said simply, and returned to his work. He followed her suggested approach exactly. The fragment came free without incident. The patient's vitals remained stable. Within 15 minutes, Richter was closing the abdomen with neat, precise sutures that would leave minimal scarring. Anna felt dizzy. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath. When the surgery concluded and the patient was wheeled to recovery, the German staff filtered out of the theater in quiet conversation. Richter remained, pulling off his gloves with slow deliberation. Anna moved to clear the instruments, keeping her head down, trying to disappear. Kamenska, come. She froze. He'd never addressed her by name before. Yes, Herr Major. She kept her eyes on the instrument tray. Your hands are too skilled for floor assistance. His voice was matter-of-fact, clinical. You have surgical training. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I was a resident. Before we arrived. Yes. A long silence. Nana could feel her heartbeat in her throat. Speaking of, before was dangerous. It implied that now was somehow wrong, somehow temporary. It implied that the occupation wasn't the permanent new order the Reich proclaimed it to be. The Reich requires efficiency, Richter said finally. Wasting trained personnel is inefficient. He pulled off his surgical cap, and Anna saw his hair for the first time, dark blonde, cut military short, already showing threads of silver at the temples. You will assist in my surgeries, directly. Not as a nurse, but as a surgical assistant. Anna's head snapped up. Herr Major, the regulations, I'm aware of the regulations. His tone didn't change. I am also aware that I perform an average of 12 high-complexity surgeries per week, and Schmidt, he named his current German surgical assistant, has the spatial reasoning of a concussed dog. You will be more useful. He walked past her toward the scrub room, then paused at the door. Report to Theater 3 at 0600 tomorrow. We have a thoracic case. Bring your competence, Kaminska. Leave your politics at the door. Then he was gone, and Anna was alone with the smell of blood and antiseptic, and the terrifying realization that she had just been given exactly what she'd lost, and from the hands of the enemy who'd taken it away. The education begins the next morning. Anna arrived at Theater 3 at 5:45, her stomach a knot of anxiety and something else she didn't want to name. Hope, maybe, or the ghost of professional pride she'd thought was dead. Richter was already there, reviewing the patient's charts. Then he glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable. Kaminska, scrub in. For the next 3 hours, Anna lived in the crystalline focus of surgery. The patient was a Luftwaffe pilot with a collapsed lung from a training accident. Richter moved through the thoracotomy with the same controlled precision she'd seen before, but this time he narrated his choices, not for the patient's benefit, but for hers. Note the adhesions from previous infection, he said, pointing with a clamp. Careless dissection here causes hemorrhage. You must separate tissue planes like you're reading a book, not tearing pages. Anna found herself responding, her medical training surging back like a flooding river. The pleural space is compromised. Do you mobilize the lung before or after? After, Richter interrupted. Watch? His hands demonstrated, efficient and sure. Mobilization under tension causes parenchymal tear. First restore the space, then reposition. It was a conversation she realized with a jolt. The jolt. A real clinical conversation, the kind she'd had with Professor Wojcik, the kind she'd thought she'd never have again. Her mind, starved for intellectual engagement, devoured every word. When the surgery concluded successfully, Richter stripped off his gloves and fixed her with that assessing stare. "You have good instincts," he said, "but your technique has gaps. War injuries are different from civilian pathology. I will teach you." "Why?" The word escaped before Anna could stop it. Richter's expression didn't change. "Because you're here. Because the Reich needs efficiency." Ha. "And because," a pause, almost imperceptible, "competence should not be wasted simply because of the accident of birth geography." It was the closest thing to kindness she'd heard from a German officer. It made her skin crawl. She didn't want his kindness. She didn't want to be grateful to him. But she was. God help her, she was. Over the following weeks, Anna was pulled deeper into Richter's orbit. They operated together 3, sometimes 4 times a day. Shattered limbs, abdominal trauma, complex vascular repairs. Richter was a relentless teacher, demanding perfection but willing to explain his reasoning. He treated her like a colleague, not a subordinate. In the operating theater, nationality seemed to evaporate, replaced by the singular focus of saving lives. The other German staff noticed. Schmidt, the displaced surgical assistant, glowered at Anna with open resentment. The nurses whispered in corners, but Richter was unbothered by their disapproval. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. A small rebellion against the rigid hierarchies of military medicine. "They think I'm contaminating myself," he remarked one day as they scrubbed out after a particularly difficult arterial repair. Lowering standards by working with a pole. Anna said nothing. What could she say? "They're idiots," Richter continued, drying his hands with mechanical precision. "Medical skill doesn't correlate with ancestry, despite what the Reich's propaganda claims. If it did, half the surgeons in Berlin would be mopping floors." It was the first time she'd heard him criticize, even obliquely, the regime he served. Anna looked at him sharply, trying to read his face, but his expression was neutral, distant. "You're staring, Kaminska. I'm wondering why you say such things to me." "Because you're the only person in this hospital with enough training to understand what I'm talking about." He met her eyes. "And because I suspect you're too practical to run to the Gestapo with tales of my insufficient enthusiasm for racial theory." It was true. Anna had no love for the regime, but she also had no death wish. Besides, Richter's heresy was small, barely worth mentioning. He still performed surgery on Wehrmacht soldiers with dedicated skill. He still wore the uniform. He still represented everything that was crushing her country into the mud. But in the operating theater, none of that seemed to matter. The morgue lesson, the summons came on a cold November evening. Anna was preparing to leave for her cramped, lightless room in the hospital's basement staff quarters when Richter appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said without preamble. "I need your eyes." She followed him through the hospital's dimly lit corridors, down 2 flights of stairs into the refrigerated silence of the morgue. The air was a clean, sharp cold that clawed at Anna's lungs and made her breath bloom in white clouds. 3 bodies lay on steel tables, covered with sheets. Richter pulled back the first sheet, revealing a young German soldier, perhaps 19, his face still bearing traces of boyish innocence despite the gray pallor of death. "Sergeant Schmidt operated on this man yesterday," Richter said, his voice echoing in the tiled room. "Simple appendectomy. The patient died 6 hours post-op. I want you to tell me why." Anna stared at him. "You want me to diagnose the failure? I want you to see what Schmidt did wrong so you never make the same mistake." It was macabre, this midnight lesson over corpses, but Anna couldn't deny the dark fascination. She'd never been allowed to perform clinical autopsies during her training. Such privileges were reserved for senior physicians. Now, in this cold room, she was being offered forbidden knowledge. She stepped closer to the body, examining the surgical site. The incision was crude, the sutures uneven. Jur. "The closure is poor, but that wouldn't cause death so quickly. Look deeper." Anna's hands hovered over the corpse, hesitant. It felt transgressive to touch the dead without permission, without ritual. But Richter was watching her with those pale, expectant eyes, and she found she couldn't disappoint him. She pressed gently on the abdomen. A dark fluid leaked from the incision. "Peritonitis," she breathed. He perforated something. The cecum, Richter confirmed. the sick'em Richter confirmed. Schmidt saw a textbook diagram of an appendectomy. He forgot that tissue is a terrain, a map of fate. Every body is different, every pathology unique. He followed his mental script instead of following the reality in front of him. He moved to stand beside her, so close she could smell the clean scent of his soap, the faint trace of cigarette smoke on his uniform. The intimacy of the proximity made her uncomfortable, not because it was unwelcome, but because it wasn't. Take the scalpel, Richter said, producing one from his pocket and pressing it into her hand. I want you to open the abdomen. Follow the true line of the wound channel, not where Schmidt wished it to be, where life directed the damage. Anna felt the illicit heat bloom beneath her resentment. This was forbidden on multiple levels. She wasn't authorized to perform autopsies, wasn't authorized to touch German soldiers' bodies, wasn't authorized to exist as anything more than a servant. But Richter was giving her permission, giving her agency, and the feeling was intoxicating. She made the incision with steady hands, peeling back layers of tissue to expose the surgical field. The perforation was obvious now, a ragged tear in the cecum, poorly repaired, leaking fecal matter into the peritoneal cavity, a death sentence delivered by incompetence. There, she said softly. He didn't achieve hemostasis before closing. Blood obscured his view. He missed the tear entirely. Correct. Richter placed a gloved hand on her wrist, not restraining, but guiding, a cold anchor against her racing pulse. This is the difference between a surgeon and a technician, Kaminska. A technician follows steps. A surgeon reads the body like a language. Every piece of tissue is a sentence, every blood vessel a word. You must become fluent. His touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. When he withdrew his hand, Anna felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. Unland. They stood in silence over the corpse, two living people in a room full of death, and Anna realized something dangerous. She respected Klaus Richter, not as a German, not as a conqueror, but as a physician. He was teaching her not because it benefited him, but because knowledge mattered to him more than politics. It was the most dangerous kind of respect, the kind that made the enemy human. The blurring lines to the crisis the air raid sirens began at 3:00, tearing through the November night like the screams of dying animals. Anna jolted awake in her narrow bed, heart-hammering, as the building shuddered from distant explosions. Soviet bombers, making their occasional harassment runs over Warsaw. She'd learned to tell the difference between harassment and genuine attack. This was harassment. A few bombs, more psychological than strategic. Still, protocol demanded that all medical staff report to their stations. Anna dressed in the dark and hurried through corridors already filling with smoke and confusion. Wounded were being brought in. Not soldiers this time, but civilians caught by a bomb that had struck a residential block 3 kilometers away. The screams echoed through the halls, Polish voices crying out in pain and terror. Theater 3 was chaos. Richter was already there, still buttoning his surgical tunic, his face in grim concentration. 2 tables were operating simultaneously. Blood on the floor, nurses, running, versus running. Someone shouting for plasma. Kaminska! Richter's voice cut through the pandemonium. Here, now! She ran to his side. On the table was a man in his 40s, unconscious, his chest crushed by falling debris. Massive hemorrhaging, blood pressure dropping. Tension pneumothorax. Richter snapped. Both lungs compromised. And flail chest. Probable cardiac tamponade. He has minutes? The German anesthesiologist was shaking his head. Herr Major, the damage is too extensive. I didn't ask for your opinion on survivability. I asked you to keep him alive while I work. Richter's hands were already moving, making the thoracotomy incision with brutal speed. Kaminska, retract. Schmidt, suction. Everyone else, shut up and do your jobs. For the next 90 minutes, Anna experienced what it meant to be part of a perfect surgical machine. Richter worked with a speed and precision that defied belief, his hands moving like separate, intelligent creatures. He barked commands, but not cruelly. Each order was necessary, economical, designed to save seconds that meant the difference between life and death, and Anna matched him. Her hands knew where to be before he asked. Her mind anticipated his next move. When he needed to decompress the pericardium, she had the needle ready. When the bleeding intensified, she had gauze in position. They moved together like dancers who'd rehearsed for years, not weeks. The room faded away. There was only the body, the blood, the desperate race against cellular death. Suture, Richter said, his voice hoarse. Anna threaded the needle and passed it over. Their fingers touched, slick with blood, and something electric passed between them. Not desire, not yet, but recognition. They were saving this man together. Two people from enemy nations, working as one flawless unit to defeat death. The heart began to beat stronger. The blood pressure stabilized. The man's chest rose and fell with assisted breathing. Richter stepped back, his surgical gown drenched in blood, his face sheened with sweat. Close for me, Schmidt. Standard procedure. He walked out of the theater without another word. Anna stripped off her gloves, her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. The other staff were staring at her with expressions ranging from respect to resentment. She'd just performed at the level of a senior surgical resident, a role forbidden to Poles under occupation law. She followed Richter. She found him in the sterilization room, standing at the sink, peeling off his gloves with slow, deliberate movements. The sound of the rubber was soft, a final stripping away of pretense. That was extraordinary, Anna said quietly. Richter didn't turn around. That was necessary. You saved him. He should have died. We saved him. Now he turned, and his eyes were intense, almost feverish. Your skill is wasted on the floor, Kaminska. It is a waste the Reich cannot afford. His meaning was a weapon. Refusal meant death by obscurity. Acceptance meant life bound to the enemy. He stepped into her space, close enough that she could smell the antiseptic and clean wool of his uniform. The truth is, he said, his voice dropping to something raw and honest, I need your hands. Anna met his gaze, the bitterness of compromise a sharp metallic taste in her mouth. She understood what he was offering. A role, a purpose, a return to who she'd been before the occupation. But it came with a price. She would be his assistant. This protégé, bound to him in a way that made her complicit in the machine she hated. She faltered, searching for words. You don't have to answer now, Richter said, but his eyes demanded acknowledgement. But you felt it in there. What we can do together, it would be criminal to waste that. He was right. She had felt it, the terrifying thrill of competence in a world designed for failure, the forbidden satisfaction of being seen, truly seen as a physician again. Anna nodded once. It was enough. The alliance was sealed, not by love, but by the shared recognition of excellence. She had gained survival, purpose, and the dangerous gift of being valued. But she had sacrificed her solitude, her clear moral lines, and the comfortable fiction that all Germans were monsters. Klaus Richter, it turned out, was worse than a monster. He was human.